All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. I'm Thomas, and I do mostly educational material. I guess this would be more like crypto education. We are going to attempt to uh, decode the resurrection, coming straight out from the Bible, and this is a decode that was made by Joseph Atwill. And there are some other videos out there debunking his work, and uh, I don't necessarily endorse his work. I am kind of trying to give it a hearing right here to see whether this decode makes sense, what you might think of it. And I like the decode particularly because you can do the whole thing strictly from the scriptures, strictly from the Gospels, um, and you don't have to refer to any outside sources. So I kind of am using this as a prima facie case. If he passes the test here, then we can look at some of his other decodes that require you to also look at other sources beside the Gospels. Okay, so I'll be reading the Gospels here, mostly I think from the NLT Easy Bible. Some of it is from King James. I was kind of comparing and contrasting, but those are the only two that I really looked at. Um, also, yeah, so the resurrection, um, you know, Jesus was, according to the Gospels, Jesus was crucified and then, supposed to be buried in this tomb. And then he was found to not be there. Okay, so this is described in all four of the Gospels. So if you're going to be following along at home, you're going to want to look at, and it's really pretty much the first half of all of these chapters: Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, and John 20. So those are the four relevant chapters that we're going to be looking at. And so all proof of and evidence in this decode is from the text. There's a couple times we have to refer to a dictionary, perhaps, but so in order for Atwill, his ideas, in order to decode the resurrection, we must read all four of these together in chronological order. When we use a chronological approach, the story starts with the arrival of Mary Magdalene at the tomb. That is where the contradictions start. If we don't resolve them logically, then the whole thing doesn't make sense, according to him. So he's going to try to figure out how to do this chronologically. So we're evaluating it chronologically, and there's a lot of different contradictions between the different versions of the Gospels. The most glaring right off the bat is Mary Magdalene, because Mary Magdalene, uh, she appears at the tomb um, four different times, and she's with different people every time. It's described that she's with different people every time, and so Atwill kind of goes over that and how he's able to he thinks he's able to logically decode this. Okay, so the time of Mary Magdalene's at the arrival at the tomb is basically where he's getting his chronological approach. Okay, so if we look at Matthew, it says, as the new day was dawning, or as it began to dawn. In Mark, it says, just at sunrise, or at the rising of the sun. In Luke, it says very early in the morning. And Mark and Luke both used the same Greek word there in the original, and both or they use different words. Proj and bathos both mean early in the morning. However, in Mark, the superlative lian, meaning extremely or beyond measure, is used in conjunction with the word that means early in the morning. So Mark, he says, it comes before Luke. In Mark, the sun has indeed risen when the visit occurs, thus creating the awkward expression, the very earliest moment in the morning after the sun had risen. Thus, Mark's version begins after Matthew's, but before Luke's. But then, if we look at John, John says, while it was still dark, early, when it was yet dark. So John actually comes before all the rest of them. In John, it was still dark. And then Matthew, as the new day was dawning, Mark, just at sunrise, and Luke, very early in the morning. Okay, so that is the order that he's wanting to do the decode in. John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So Mary Magdalene arrives at these 4 times. So that doesn't quite make sense. And the Mary Magdalene contradictions go deeper. There's also some contradictions having to do with the other Mary, or Mary, mother of James. They seem to appear twice as well, but don't appear the other 2 times. But in John, Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb alone. In Matthew, Mary Magdalene comes with the other Mary. In Mark, she comes with Salome, Mary, and Mary, mother of James. And in Luke, it's called the women, which is later identified as Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, Joanna, and several others. So the contradictions start right off the bat with who is Mary Magdalene with, and how is she actually showing up 4 different times, basically with 4 different groups of people. So Atwill's going to try to approach this in a chronological manner, but also using logic. Okay, now what Atwill does to kind of circumvent this whole process is that he assumes that there are actually 4 Mary Magdalenes. And what he says in order to do this is, first of all, that Magdala was a town in Galilee. So a Magdalene is just a person from the town of Magdala. So Magdalene is not so much of a name as it is of a placeholder. I'm a Chicagoan, or I'm a New Yorker. Magdala was a much smaller town, but so he's saying that maybe there were 4 separate women that all came from Magdala. And to kind of buttress this idea, he also says that the name Mary is more of a title than a name. And Mary basically was a kind of a slang term that the Romans used that basically means rebellious female. Now, in Galilee, or in all of the Holy Land at that time, the Romans had control And the Romans, the Jews were a total thorn in their side. The Jews were always revolting, always killing, uh, killing the Romans or attacking or fighting back, especially certain groups, especially this one group called the Sicarii. And um, they were um, they were a pain in the butt for the Romans to manage. And so um, the term that the Romans started using for a rebellious Jewish female was Mary, according to um, Atwill here. So this would also apply to all the other Marys that are in the Bible, in the New Testament anyway, and there's a lot of them. And so, and also Martha applies to that as well. So Martha is just an offshoot of Mary. So we will assume that for the purposes of this decode, for Atwill's sake, that there are 4 Mary Magdalens, and there are 2 Mary, mother of James, and 2 other Marys, at least. Okay, so now we're going to try to set the stage here by reading John, and John chapter 20, just the first, I think, 10, the first 10 verses, and that just kind of sets the stage, and then we're going to kind of intersperse them. Okay, so here's John from chapter 20. Early Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they have put him." Peter and the other disciple ran to the tomb to see. The other disciple outran Peter and got there first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen cloth lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying to the side. Then the other disciple went in, and he saw and believed. For until then, they hadn't realized that the scriptures said he would rise from the dead. Then they went home. Now, okay, so then they went home. That's kind of where you want to end it. And so one question that I have here is from John 20, verse 9. Until then, they hadn't realized that the scriptures said he would rise from the dead. He saw and believed, for until then, they hadn't realized. So what happened? What was the thing that happened that caused them to realize that the scriptures said? Because all that happened is that he walked into the tomb. He saw the other disciple also went in. That's it turns out that this is John, the other disciple. Then the other disciple also went in, and he saw and believed. But what did he see? He saw a lack of Jesus being there. Like, he saw that Jesus was not there, but he's not really. But what would that do to make him realize that the scriptures said that he would rise from the dead? So that's a kind of, for me, kind of a glaring inconsistency. The other issues I think are less, uh, not worth looking at, I guess, right off the bat. Mary, she looks in, or it doesn't even say whether she looked in. She came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away. She ran from there. The stone had been rolled away from the entrance, and then she ran and found Simon Peter and John, the other disciple. So she didn't even look in. She just saw that the stone was rolled away, possibly. Maybe it just doesn't mention. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to break that up. That part that I just read from John, chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. And we're going to start with John chapter 20, and we're going to read the first, I think, 5 verses. And then we're going to put the next gospel in, Matthew. Okay, remember he did this by chronological order. Okay, so first we go with the John and then to the Matthew. And then we'll sprinkle in the John again, and then the Mark, and then a little more John, and then Luke, and then back to John. Okay, early Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they have put him." Which implies that she did look inside, but it doesn't say that. Peter and the other disciple ran to the tomb to see. The other disciple outran Peter and got there first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen cloth lying there, but he didn't go in. Okay, now we're going to go to Matthew 28, verse 1. Early on Sunday morning, as the new day was dawning, Mary Magdalene, we'll say Mary Magdalene, the other, number 2, and the other Mary, number 1, went out to see the tomb. Now, that's a contradiction, obviously, right there, because Mary Magdalene has already run away from the tomb to go tell Peter and John about this, and John and Peter ran back. So unless Mary Magdalene is faster than them both and ran back herself and somehow got Mary on the way, that would be a contradiction. But it wouldn't be a contradiction if it's a different Mary Magdalene. Okay, so Mary Magdalene number 2 and the other Mary went out to see the tomb. Suddenly, there was a great earthquake. Now, Atwill says that word is more like a commotion than an earthquake. So he's saying that it's really the sound of people running and stopping. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, because an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and rolled aside the stone and sat on it. Now, Mary Magdalene has already seen the stone was rolled away, but Matthew seems to be reaching here a little bit. But because an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and rolled aside the stone and sat on it. Already, Mary already saw that, but okay, so the angel came down from heaven is suspect. Okay, verse 3, 28, verse 3. His face shone like lightning, and his clothing was as white as snow. He's referring to the angel that he identified there, who came down from heaven and rolled away the stone. Matthew 28:4. The guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint. Then the angel spoke to the women. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I know you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He isn't here. He has been raised from the dead, just as he said would happen. Come, see where his body was lying." And now, so it kind of implies that they went and saw where his body was lying. And now Matthew 28:7. Now go quickly and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead, and he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. Remember, I have told you. Okay, so now we go back to John. Now, remember, Mary and the other Mary came. They saw one person who in Matthew is identified as an angel sitting on a stone, the stone that had been rolled away. And this angel was able to tell them that his body wasn't lying there and that he has been raised from the dead. He has been raised from the dead just as he said would happen. So back to John. Then Simon Peter arrived. Okay, now remember, John had arrived because he won the race. He ran faster. He got there first. He stooped and looked in, but he did not go in. But then Simon Peter comes in second, and he arrives and he immediately goes inside. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. Okay, so that creates a moment where Simon Peter is inside the tomb alone. He also noticed that the linen wrappings lying there. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying to the side. That's a detail to pay attention to also. Okay, so at first we have an instance where John is there by himself, but he's only outside of the tomb. And then Simon Peter comes, or Peter, and he just goes inside alone. Okay, and now we go to Mark. Mark 16, verse 1. 1 through 8 or something. The next evening, okay, so this is talking about Saturday evening before Sunday. The next evening, when the Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, presumably number 3, Mary Magdalene, and Salome, and Mary, the mother of James, number 1, went out and purchased burial spices to put on Jesus's body. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they came to the tomb. Okay, so this is really the third Mary Magdalene that's arrived at the tomb within the just a matter of minutes, between while it was still dark and very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise. On the way, they were discussing who would roll the stone away. Okay, so this also indicates that this Mary Magdalene does not know that the stone has already been rolled away. On the way, they were discussing who would roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb. But when they arrived, they looked up and saw that the stone, a very large one, had already been rolled aside. So they entered the tomb, and there on the right sat a young man, clothed in a white robe. The women were startled. But the angel says, so Mark immediately jumps to the idea that this, first they say he saw a young man, but in the next verse, he's an angel. But the angel said, "Do not be so surprised. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He isn't here. He has been raised from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body." And his body isn't there. So, okay, back to Mark 16:7. Now go and give this message to his disciples, including Peter. Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you before he died. So then the women left. Then the other disciple, going back to John. Okay, so the women left. Okay, now we'll catch up here. Okay, so he has been raised from the dead. Look where his body, and then this angel in the cave, in the tomb. Now go and give this message to his disciples, including Peter. So this person is not Peter, apparently, but it's an angel. So that kind of does create an argument that this person is not Peter, even though we just saw in John that Peter, or Simon Peter, went into the tomb. And so he was in the tomb, and now at this time, because if you're looking chronologically at the time that they're arriving at the tomb, it's got to be within a very short period between while it was still dark, just at sunrise, and then very, very early in the morning. This is all kind of all happening at the same time. Okay, so now we go back to John. Then the other disciple also went in. Okay, that's John. Then and Peter's already in there, or in the Gospel of John, Peter is already in there. He went in there in verse 7 or verse 6. Here in verse 8, then the other disciple also went in, and he saw and believed. So there's something that that puts off a light bulb for John here when he comes in. He saw and believed, for until then they had, now it's going to they instead of he. So they being Simon, Peter, and John, they hadn't realized that the scriptures said he would rise from the dead. But if you do go back to Matthew, the angel in Matthew says, now go quickly and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead, and he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. Remember, I've told you. Well, no, that's not... yeah, so I don't know. That's an interesting question. Why is John and Peter all of a sudden realize? Why did they realize that he had that Jesus, that this is in Scripture? Okay, so that's That makes it a little bit confusing for me. But he saw and believed, for until then they hadn't realized that the scriptures said he would rise from the dead. Okay, now we're going to go to Luke. After the yeah, okay, we go to Luke. So John leaves us with both Simon Peter and John in the tomb. And then we go to Luke. Very early on Sunday morning, the women came to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. They found that the stone covering the entrance had been rolled aside. So they went in, but they couldn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. They were puzzled, trying to think what could have happened to it. Suddenly, which is a word that's used quite a bit in this tale here, suddenly 2 men appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes. The women were terrified and bowed low before them. Then the men asked, why are you looking in a tomb for someone who is alive? He isn't here. He has risen from the dead. Don't you remember what he told you back in Galilee? That the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and that he would rise again the 3rd day. Then they remembered that he had said this. For until then, then they remembered he had said this. Okay, now, so then the women rushed back to tell his 11 disciples and everyone else what would happen. And it says the women who went to the tomb were Mary Magdalene, so that would be Mary Magdalene number 4, Joanna, Mary, mother of James, and several others. Okay, so you could think that those were the same from Mark, except that for Mark it was Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, and I think Salome. And in this case, it's Joanna and several others. So, but they both came to anoint him or, prepare his body or something. So that could possibly be the same as in Mark. I think that I think Luke is fairly derivative of Mark in the first place, but so it still could be Mary Magdalene number 3. We could possibly say that. Okay, but the story, so they told the apostles what had happened, but the story sounded like nonsense, so they didn't believe it. Okay, so I'm going to kind of stop right there and just analyze this a little bit. This goes much further, and Atwill goes much further with this. This is just the kind of the beginning of the decode, and like I said, I'm just trying to make it a prima facie case. So whether it's something that could be taken seriously by because you're only dealing with the Gospels here. We're not bringing in any extraneous sources. The rest of his decodes usually require that you go to other sources too. So, but what he's pointing out here, and if you read it in this order, you can see it. You read John, Mary Magdalene runs away from the tomb. She sees Simon Peter and John, tells them about that the stone has been rolled away, and she says she can't find the body. And so then Simon Peter and John run to the tomb to check it out. And they get there, and John gets there first. Okay, he stoops in, and he sees that there isn't a body there, or perhaps that's what he sees. And he also sees the linen cloth and the headband that's folded up. And then, um, according to Atwill's Decode, then what happens is we go to Matthew 28. And in Matthew 28, Mary and Mary Magdalene and the other Mary show up. And there's a commotion. He calls it an earthquake. There's a commotion, and then all of a sudden they see an angel sitting on a rock, sitting on the rock that was blocking the tomb. And there's some guards there, and the guards faint or something like that. And the angel tells them that the body's not there. Come take a look. And so they take a look. They leave. And then Simon Peter finally runs up to the tomb, and he goes right in. This is after after Mary and the other Mary left. And then Simon Peter shows up, and he goes right in. John is still outside. And so Atwill is saying that they mistook the angel or John for the angel. That John is the person that's sitting on the rock outside the tomb. And then Simon Peter comes, he immediately goes in. When he goes in, that's when Mary Magdalene shows up with Salome and Mary, the mother of James, and they go right in the tomb also. How they didn't see John, I'm not sure, but they go straight in, and then they see an angel. First it's described as a man, and then they describe it as, and then Mark describes it as an angel. So this is coming from Mark. In Mark, Mary Magdalene and the Salome and Mary, the mother of James, show up, and they go right into the tomb, and they see a young man, but then next thing, Mark is calling him an angel, and he says that he's not here. What are you expecting him to be? Why would you expect him to be here? Whatever he says. And so then they leave, and they go to tell other people about it. And then John finally goes into the tomb, and something happens when John goes in that makes him realize that the scriptures had been saying this all along, and that Jesus had told them about this. And so now John and Simon Peter are both in the tomb, and that is when Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, and Joanna and several others show up in Luke. And they show up, and they see two people inside the tomb, who also relay that same message and send them on their way. And then the Simon Peter and John leave, and they leave, and then we go back to John, and Mary Magdalene comes back, or another Mary comes back. So that's the basic decode. Is what he's really saying is that the whole group of these people, all these disciples, basically delude each other into thinking that this has happened. Now, we also need to go to John 11. If we go to John 11, we hear what's going on. So Mary is the person that discovered that the tomb was empty. that the stone had been rolled aside. Um, and everything is kind of based on that. Then everybody goes to that same place, sees the stone rolled aside, and thinks that that's the tomb of Jesus, and then sees the linen and the headband that are folded up. Now, if we go back to John 11, then we're talking about Lazarus. And if you remember, Lazarus is kind of like the brother of a certain Mary Magdalene and Martha. And he was buried in a tomb earlier that week. And Jesus had been kind of like dilly-dallying instead of coming to try to help him because he was very sick, and they kind of reprimand Jesus because it took him so long to get there, and that Lazarus has been dead already for 4 days or something like that. And then Jesus goes to the tomb of Lazarus, and Jesus demands that Lazarus come out of the tomb. And he comes out of the tomb. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with bandages, and his face wrapped in with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Before that, even Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And then Jesus then commands Lazarus to come out of the tomb, and his hands and feet were bound with bandages, and his face wrapped in a linen cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Okay, so what Atwill is really pointing at is that Mary is mistaking Jesus's tomb for Lazarus's tomb. So when she comes looking for Jesus's tomb, she finds Lazarus's tomb, and the stone has already been rolled aside because that's what Jesus ordered in the first place. And then they see the linen cloth and the headband or whatever lying next to the tomb, or just inside the tomb, and they interpret that as being Jesus's, but Atwill is saying that it's really Lazarus's. So he's really kind of saying that this whole thing is kind of like a giant Three's Company episode or some sitcom where it's just a comedy of one error after another, where these people are deluding themselves into thinking that they're angels and that the stone has been rolled away and Jesus' body isn't there, but it's a total mistaken identity for one tomb for the other, and they delude each other over and over again and then they go tell each other all about it. And this is also springs from what he says is, all the prophecies from the Old Testament, had all these Jews in this very messianistic mode already. They already were expecting the Messiah to be there, to be coming. And so, there were, he calls it actually a herd of Jesuses. Like there were Jesuses everywhere. There were all these different people who were, kind of saying that they were Jesus, saying that the end is coming and that people need to find God and all these different things. And so he was really just saying that was in the air, and it's kind of like wishful thinking for them to kind of stir up this whole idea that. But not only that, then the other part of this is that, this whole thing basically assumes that whoever wrote Matthew also wrote Mark and also wrote Luke and also wrote John. Like that the author of the Gospels is all the same person because they're all fitting together. And so that becomes a huge problem, like that this whole thing was forged and who did it, who wrote it. And if you're right, who wrote it? So those all bring up interesting questions that I don't have the answers to, but Atwill does claim to have the answers to that, and that is a very interesting uh, argument that he makes about who actually did write this. And we'll probably get into this next time, but I'll just stop right there. Wish you a happy Easter. I honestly, even if this decode is correct, I don't think that I mean, it doesn't like destroy Christianity or something like that, but does, it does, uh, I think it does require a little bit of a reality check, that you know all this stuff is not necessarily literal. That that the, you know you can still be in the spirit of Jesus, but you don't have to take all of this absolutely literally. I mean, if we took everything that was in the Bible literally, uh, I mean, that's the tallest tale. And if you read that tale and it wasn't the Bible, you would say that it's mythology. And